Hey, what is going on, everybody out there? This is Jakejames Lugo. Welcome to the channel, guys. Hopefully, you guys have been enjoying all the great content we've been putting up on the Koalition.com and the Koalition YouTube channel. As always, I always come back to you guys with some interesting, fun stuff for you guys to enjoy, to listen to, and check out, give yourself some food for thought. But today, I got a cool special guest from Zeboyd Games. I got Bill Stiernberg, who is one of the developers on Cosmic Star Heroine. The game just came out for Switch not too long ago, but it's also available on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation Vita. But Bill, thank you. What's going on? How you been?
Hey, thanks for having me on your show, I guess you could say. Everything's going really well. Like you said, it just launched on Switch, our game Cosmic Star Heroine. We're just like kind of in this weird, excited mood of yeah, it's stressful. There's we're constantly looking to see how is it doing on the Switch, how are people receiving it there. But I gotta say, everything's going really well. I would say the vast majority of the response has been super positive, and it's just really cool to finally have this on a Nintendo system. Since we launched this on PlayStation 4, we got it ported to Vita. We've had our past games on the Xbox 360, and we've done Steam. So this is kind of a whole new realm of console owners that we never really got to before. Yeah.
Yeah. So, having that being said, I mean, were there other things maybe you guys have to think about a little bit differently when the game was getting ported over to the Switch? Because again, you mentioned it was on PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita. You've worked on various other projects with Xbox One and on Steam. Was there other things maybe you guys had to keep in mind or that you were possibly worried about when the game was going to come over to the Switch?
Well, I would say that there wasn't a whole lot that we were worried about. But before we got it ported, there was a couple of concerns. So I guess the first one that we were concerned about initially was how it was going to look in portable, in handheld mode.
That's good. That's true. Yeah.
And I say that because it's a pixel art game, which you think, oh, it's going to look great on the small, vibrant Nintendo Switch screen, which is true. It actually looks awesome now. The reason we were concerned initially is because the game was designed for a 1080p resolution. And because obviously originally it was PS4 and Steam, and then 1080p scales down, or rather I should say the PlayStation Vita screen scales up by a factor of 4. I think it's like a 540p, technically 544p, but 540p screen. So when you have our game, we initially designed it for 1080p, and when we were deciding on the resolution of the presentation of the game itself, the pixel art resolution, we decided on 270p, I think, so that when it scales to 1080p, it's an exact factor of 4. So all the pixels are nice and square, and there's no squishing or stretching or whatever.
It looks kind of the same for the most part.
It looks crisp and clean. And then on the Vita screen, it's a factor of 2. Or so, it goes up to 540p from 270p or whatever, what have you, and so it's also a whole number factor increase. So the pixels are all a perfect square, and everything looks really nice. 720p, I believe it does not scale exactly to 720p, so that the pixels weren't going to be exactly perfect squares, and I was worried is that going to look funny? Is it going to have some kind of weird artifacting when it's in motion?
But it worked out in the end overall, though.
Yeah, it worked out great. We ended up working with Limited Run Games to port it to Switch, and which, by the way, they're super awesome. They have this the guy who worked with us mostly on the port. His name is Adrian, and he did a super quick, fast job, and but it turned out so well. He did an incredible job, and
that's cool.
The port is so smooth, and he ended up trying out different ways of scaling to the 720p Switch screen, and the one that ended up being the best was actually letting the Switch render the game internally at 1080p and then just displaying that on the 720p screen. So it's sort of it's what is it, super scaling or what? I don't remember what the technical
scaling.
Yeah, it's where you rendered a higher internal resolution and then you display it on the lower resolution one. It's doing that, and there was enough of performance overhead that the game still runs at a solid 60 frames per second in portable mode, even though internally it's rendering at 1080p.
That's pretty cool. I mean, it sounds like it overall just makes things a little bit easier to manage, or at least you know the results to get to where exactly you want it to get without too much hassle.
Yeah, the hassle, if that didn't work, if the other modes or ideas that Adrian from Limited Run had, if those didn't work, like, the worst case scenario would have been having to reformat how and where the user interface elements would fit on a 720p format. But that wasn't necessary because, what is it, downscaling or whatever it's called from 1080p to 720p from a 1080p resolution ended up working really well, and it looks really nice on the Switch screen. So I really am super happy how it turned out.
That's pretty cool. So I want to ask you a couple questions about Cosmic Star Heroine. Now, I have to say that we're reviewing the game right now. We're using the PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita version of the game for our review. So I don't want to get too much into my impressions of it, but I do want to know a little bit about, like, some of your guys' thought processes when you were designing certain things about Cosmic Star Heroine. Because myself, and I'm pretty sure a lot of other people have, noticed and have talked about a bunch of stuff that, they see that are very similar to, specifically the RPG or JRPG genre. Like, again, a lot of people look at it and they say they see a lot of inspiration from like Phantasy Star. They probably see a lot of like, quote unquote Blade Runner style type of like visuals and inspiration. I kind of want to know, like, what were some of the big sources that you guys pulled from when you were putting together Cosmic Star Heroine?
So the original idea, so it was conceived after we had done Breath of Death 7, Cthulhu Saves the World, and Two Penny Arcade games. Yeah. And we felt like the settings of those games were all kind of fantasy-esque.
Like traditional fantasy, more like?
Yeah, especially Breath of Death 7 and Cthulhu Saves the World. Like with forests and caves and castles and magic. Yeah. And even Rainslick, which is a little bit different. Rainslick 4, you end up taking place in this underhell, this hellish world, which is kind of like a fantasy setting anyway. And we wanted to get away from that because we wanted to get away from the fantasy setting because we just felt like, we want to do something really fresh and interesting and like different. Yeah, and the science fiction, like the pure science fiction setting, is less common for Japanese style RPGs, especially like retro style ones. So we thought it would be really fresh for us, and it would help the game stick out a little bit from everything else out there. And so our first idea from that was, one of our favorite sort of science fiction JRPGs growing up was Phantasy Star. And we thought, well, what would we do if we were given like a chance to make like a modern, like
a reimagining of like Phantasy Star?
Yeah, exactly. With our own ideas and stuff. Obviously, we don't have the license to make a Phantasy Star,
of course.
But that was how we conceived of that. But after that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that drove the design and drove the aesthetic. You mentioned Blade Runner. So, like, obviously, it's got sort of a late 16-bit, early 32-bit, or a CD era.
SNES era, style. Sega CD, Sega Saturn type of like era.
Yeah, exactly. And that was another thing we really wanted to do. We really wanted to put out a game that was clearly, like, at a glance, you would think, 16-bit. You wouldn't look at it and think, is it 8-bit, or is it like 16-bit, or is it somewhere in between? And so we pushed real hard on doing, like, Sega CD late 16-bit era presentation. But as far as the actual aesthetic of the game, like the whole Blade Runner thing, that was obviously a big inspiration for me, because what I really wanted to do, we were kind of making this retro game, right? So I thought it would be cool to make the presentation look like a 1980s or early 90s vision of what the future would be like.
Yeah, so exactly. That's what stood out to me when I first played the game.
Right. So, Blade Runner has its own classic aesthetic now, but that was a game from, I think, the late 70s. I said game. A movie from the very late 70s, like 78 or 79, and it was envisioning what the future would be like. And so I took inspiration from, stuff like Blade Runner and the Alien movies and, Star Wars.
I even saw a little bit of RoboCop in there, like, just looking at it and kind of associating it with that type of style of storytelling.
Right, just like a lot of the science fiction element, like vision, kind of what they thought. And it's funny because I really liked that because they never foresaw things necessarily like we have today, which are advanced. So in their vision of the future, you have like giant CRT monitors. So you still have these huge wires running everywhere, conduit, like rusty conduits and like heavy machinery. Whereas it's only 2018, right? And we've got like Wi-Fi and we have like
We got
cell
iPods.
phones. Yeah, but and so I designed Cosmic Star Heroine's aesthetic to be like, this is the future, but it's this clunky, rusty, heavy, like neon glowing future, and it was a lot of fun to do that aesthetic.
That's cool. Now, did the music also go along hand in hand with that? Like, did the visuals and that approach to the style and the aesthetic of it, did that also dictate the tone of the music? Because when I listen to the soundtrack as I'm playing it, I immediately just get, like, in my head, visions of, like, that synth from that you heard a lot from the 80s that are usually associated with these types of, like, stories or these types of movies.
Yeah, it was for sure. It's because we worked with Hyperduck Soundworks, who are two guys who do amazing work with music and sound. And everybody should just like look up who they are. If you're a developer, ask them to do their soundtrack with them. They're amazing, and you can get the soundtrack to the game from them too. So we work closely with them, and usually when developing the soundtrack with them, we would discuss like our own inspiration for the game, which is like a 1980s like vision of the future, and then also a lot of 90s Sega CD style stuff, so like the Lunar games, and that kind of blended in with a lot of anime, like classic animes from that era. There's actually a bunch of classic sci-fi animes from that era, and as long as stuff like Blade Runner and things like that. So they really took it to heart and incorporated that 80s synth sound and like that sort of the mood and tone like that goes right along with the game. And we also gave them just like references, like, hey, check out this song. Like, that's just the general direction. We think this would sound good for this
like
setting.
The feel of it.
Yeah, and I would send them the concept art or the drafts of the dungeons or the maps of the towns, so they could kind of try and tie in the sound of it with how it looks too. And they would come back with us right after a discussion with a draft, and they're like, okay, here's a draft. It's really rough. So just give us an idea of, if you think we should keep going in this way or pull back on that element or push up on this element. And we'd listen to it and we're like, this is amazing. Like, this is perfect like this. What do you mean it's a draft? It's awesome. And they would, and then they would basically be like, okay, cool, and just polish it up. But, every time they came to us with something, we were always like, wow, you guys nailed it on basically the first try.
So with that being said, either visually or even with the soundtrack, were there certain things that maybe that you guys wanted to do or certain directions you wanted to go, but whether it was limitations or just like certain things that just weren't coming together all right that prevented you from doing so?
Well, what do you mean, like features in the game, or like
no, non-gameplay wise? I mean, like just certain aesthetics or just certain designs of like either creatures or characters, or even just certain pieces of music and sounds that maybe just didn't match well with everything else that you had done up to a particular point. That just, again, you guys thought it was good, but maybe it didn't work for this particularly right here.
Oh, I mean, there's always stuff that we want to do to like push it further. I mean, I think something I would have liked, and I think would have made Robert's life easier, is if there was just, if our game engine, so we wrote, Robert created an RPG and like a 2D RPG engine within Unity to make this. So it's on the Unity engine, but it's our own custom like RPG engine on top of that. It's got a feature set for producing the cutscenes, like the Sega CD style cutscenes you see in the game.
Yeah.
But it's rather limited, and a lot of stuff I had to kind of animate the brute force way, and by that I mean, instead of creating like, let's say a spaceship flying through space, I would create a sprite of a spaceship and give it some animation, a looping space background, and then like some planets. And then with the code, Robert would like parallax them and move them around the screen. But there were some elements which just didn't work. Like, we couldn't do easily that way, and I had to just brute force animate every single frame. And so the game would just play a series of frames. And that created a problem because A, it was a lot more work for me just brute forcing it, and B, it was and B, it was a lot of work or it was a lot of trouble for the game consoles because it takes up a lot of memory. Like, it just chews up the memory on these things, and stuff like the Vita, you only have so much to work with. So if we had like a more flexible, more feature-filled like cutscene engine, that would help. As far as tools, like, it would also help if we had more tools, like game like dungeon building tools or scripting tools for on-map cutscenes and things like that, or just tools where you can place the battles and where the enemies go, instead of Robert having to kind of like guesstimate and then write it in by code by hand, and then testing it in a build and seeing if things are in the right place. That takes up a lot of time. So I think if we had some more tools, that would help a huge amount. If we had like a more flexible cutscene engine, that could have helped with memory constraints. There's a bunch of like little things, I wish we could have done, but I mean, it's hard to foresee what you'll need until you start doing it. You know what I mean?
True, good point. Now, I want to know also a little bit about the cutscenes, because you mentioned that they have that kind of Sega CD style aesthetic to them. Why specifically that approach, though? Because, I mean, you look at other games in the genre, and sometimes they probably won't even go with cutscenes. They'll just go with the sprite work and the dialogue with text and stuff.
Yeah.
But you guys decide to give that little extra oomph with the cutscenes like that. But why specifically this style of cutscene?
Well, so our aesthetic was going to be 16-bit anyway. Because I really personally I want to push myself there to begin with. I wanted to shoot for something like late 16-bit era because, I mean, that's considered kind of a classic era, and it's a huge challenge for one artist and asset guy, like one person making all the art and also making all the dungeons and all the characters and animations. But I just wanted to do it because I wanted to. I wanted that to be something that I've always looked forward to doing. So we already had that look and aesthetic and style established, and we were trying to figure out how we would do certain storytelling, sequences. Should we do them all on the map and then have more of a complex scripting engine, or do more cutscenes of some kind? That's the traditional
way. That's like the traditional way you see with a lot of other RPGs.
Yeah, because on the cartridge consoles, they didn't have space for a lot of audio, like voice acting audio or music, and they didn't have a lot of space for giant animated sprites that you'll see in Sega CD cutscenes, and certainly they didn't have room for full motion video.
Yeah.
And so they had to have scripted like sprites on the maps type stuff. But we don't have that limitation, obviously, in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So for us, it was a choice, and we decided to do Sega CD because that style of cutscene where you have like a scene that's letterboxed, and you have like a high quality like artwork that's animated and with a soundtrack, because a lot of the inspiration for this game also came from the working designs games from the Sega CD. Like that's another big inspiration for this, for the writing and the tone of the game, is the Lunar games and just the general direction that the working designs games that came out on Sega CD were. And those were also a huge like influence on us just for making RPGs in general. And we thought it would be amazing to do that.
Very stylized.
And yeah, it is. And we started to look at how they did it back in the day, and they did it similar to we based our methods on a similar way, which is, instead of just having pre-rendered video, you can save a lot of memory and produce a lot more actual cutscenes if you have a scripting engine that can handle large sprites and like scrolling backgrounds. So the cutscenes in Cosmic Star Heroine, you'll have, a scrolling space background, you'll have planets that are sprites, and you'll have a sun that is that's casting like a transparent like rays over those planets, and then you'll have in the foreground like the shuttle, and then the base ship, and then they'll be animated to have flashing lights, and then we'll tell the engine, at this many milliseconds you play this animation, and then you move this sprite from point A to point B. The point being that like it produces a very smooth looking cutscene because it's running at 60 frames per second because it's being scrolled by the engine, and it also cuts down on the memory resources that it takes because it's not loading up 100 sequential frames. It's loading up, a sprite with 5 frames of animation and a scrolling background with, tiles. And that's a big reason. And it also saved us the trouble of having to script every single story scene and it also gave us the ability to show a character in detail without, every time we wanted, what did we want to do? Every time you met a character, we wanted a brief cutscene to show
like
what they look like.
And just showcase like what they're doing or like what they're all about.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was a really cool, fairly easy way to do, because I would have to draw like one detailed image and then a cool way of showing them like entering the scene. And that was a fun way to introduce each character. Whereas the other way would just boil down to essentially, the sprite, which is totally fine. It leaves a lot to the imagination, but I thought this would be a cool way to do it.
Yeah. Now, did you guys ever think about voice acting? Because I know there's very light, like I guess you could say voice actor, very light speech, in some of the some of the sections in the game, without spoiling it and stuff. But like
Right.
with the way and the approach that you guys took with the cutscenes and a lot of the other stuff that you mentioned before, did you guys even think about having like maybe voice actors come in and do some of the dialogue, or maybe some of the cutscenes have a little bit of dialogue, or was that never on the table to begin with?
Oh, I'm pretty sure we thought about it really early on, and we talked to some other developers that did cut dialogue, like voice to dialogue, and we started to find out that you can't just take random people and put them on a cheap webcam mic, and just say, here, read these lines. That's
You got to do a little bit more than that.
way more. I mean, we never thought it would be like that, right? But we knew it would be more than that. We started talking to developers, and they're like, you want to do voice acting really well or not at all?
Yeah, good advice there.
Yeah, you don't want to be in between. And we're like, okay, what does it take to do it well? And it's like, well, first you have to find a casting someone that's going to do the casting, and someone who's going to be a director. And then that person also has to be extremely familiar with the script, the characters, and the story and what happens. And then they got to find and hire, all the different people that are talented, legitimate voice actors that have the skill to do this and the equipment to do this remotely, and then record and you edit and da-da-da-da. So the costs are going up and up and up for our small two-man team. We're like, I don't know if we can budget this. And then
there's much.
Yeah, and then there's the complication of if you ever need to edit the script or change something or toss out a scene and introduce a new scene, you got to redo all of the voice acting for that segment or create a new segment. So it just became so ambitious for compared to everything else that we decided it was just outside the scope of what we could do.
I see. So one more thing I want to touch on, before we wrap up, is that, talk a little bit about obviously the gameplay of Cosmic Star Heroine. That opening scene, which I think that pretty much most of the stuff I've seen online and when people talk about this game, they usually gravitate towards that opening scene with the main heroine, where you're kind of scaling up the skyscraper with the grapple hook and stuff, which I think is pretty cool. I think it's pretty dope.
Yeah.
Did you guys, when you were thinking up stuff like that, because you don't really see a lot of segments or sections like that in a lot of other RPGs.
Right.
I mean, the closest one I could think of that probably comes remotely close to that would be in Final Fantasy VI with the Ghost Train. And
right.
It's there's a battle, and then there's movement, there's action, there's all this stuff going on. All over the place and stuff. And then obviously that's how Cosmic Star Heroine starts off with. I mean, did you guys think about stuff like that? I mean, what was the challenge of constructing a scene or a section like that?
Well, what we really wanted to do is we had this game, which is a science fiction espionage, spy fiction style game, right? So we thought to ourselves, what would be really cool is if we had a lot of James Bond style elements to it, since it's you're a spy and it's this science fiction game. And so we had a week-long period or so where we just brainstormed, what are cool things that spies do? They have
what makes spies cool?
What makes them awesome? Why is what are the coolest James Bond moments? What are the coolest the crazy stuff you see in random games like Metal Gear Solid, for example? And we had all kinds of ideas, and scaling a wall while shooting down enemies, enemy drones was one of the first ones. We had other wild ideas. I mean, I could spoil one of the cool ones.
No spoilers.
Okay, good. Okay, there's a cool one that's 30 minutes later.
I know which one you're talking about, because there's a couple that I've seen that are pretty interesting that I don't want to spoil.
Yeah, and so we would think about different locales with cool things, and how could we create cool scenes that a spy, you would only really see a super spy do, and that and then we incorporated those into the different areas of the story that we could. We wanted to keep it exciting, and a big thing that we decided early on in development is we were actually inspired by Final Fantasy VII for this. Is Final Fantasy VII's opening? It starts out with a
mission.
Yeah, it does, but even the opening cutscene is it's this overview of the planet, and then it zooms in within a minute or two, and then bam, you're dropped off from this train, and you're in the middle of the action. and that was such a cool way to open up the game, to like show you the
like
universe.
In medias res, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. And it also means that as soon as the gameplay starts, you're a super spy. You're not like a kid getting out of bed, or like, you know what I mean? You're not like coming back to your town that's been burned down by the bad guy and you're a kid and you have to find a sword. You start out as a spy who's experienced and has weapons and gadgets and is already blowing up like, you know, bad, like evil robot machines and scaling walls and rescuing hostages. And we thought that would be a blast to start the game out like that, whereas most RPGs start out with a town.
It's a very slow build up in most RPGs.
Exactly. So that kind of set the pace for the whole entire game.
Yeah, it definitely shows. Definitely shows, and I could see that because just the reaction from the way that people talk about the game now, even before the Switch version came out not too long ago, people, when they would talk about Cosmic Star Heroine, they would always talk about that one scene. I think that's pretty cool. And it's testament to the good work that you guys have been doing or whatnot with it. So we're gonna wrap this up. So Bill, thank you for chatting up with me, chatting up Cosmic Star Heroine, JRPGs, RPGs, and stuff.
Yeah.
Where can everybody find you right now? Where are you guys at on social media?
So the easiest place to find us is Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Bill@Zeboyd, which is, you know, BILL_AT_ZEBOYD. Our Zeboyd company Twitter handle that we use for just general, you know, company developer news is @Zeboyd Games, and then Robert, who is the other half of Zeboyd Games that does the code and design and writing. He is @Where'sUmpire, which is WEREZOMPIRE, and we're both like pretty available on Twitter. We also have like a Facebook and a website, but we mostly are reachable by that.
So there'll be links in the description box below for you guys. If you guys are listening to this on YouTube now, you guys can go directly to all those things that we just mentioned now. So definitely, again, Bill, appreciate you chatting up with me about Cosmic Star Heroine. Guys, if you can, leave me a comment down below and leave a like on this video as well when you guys get a chance. Tell me some of your guys' favorite and most interesting questions about Cosmic Star Heroine or any of the things that we talked about throughout this entire episode. With that being said, we will talk to you again very soon. Peace out and stay epic, everybody.